I am Arthur Vance. I am 34 years old. Last month, while I was sitting in a high-stakes corporate boardroom desperately trying to secure a promotion just to pay off the massive debts I took on for my brother's $100,000 wedding, my golden child brother texted me. He said, "You are not invited to the wedding. Goodbye, loser." And my father? He actually liked the message. They laughed at me in a family group chat in front of 20 different relatives, tossing me aside like garbage after draining my bank accounts dry. But there is one thing they did not know. They had absolutely no idea I had uncovered the real will. They had no idea I found the inheritance they thought they stole from me in the dark. And right now, as we speak, they are the ones on their knees begging for mercy. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their entire lives piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe in absolute justice. And do not forget to let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Let us go back to the exact second the illusion shattered. I was sitting in a custom leather ergonomic chair on the 42nd floor of my financial firm's downtown high-rise. The air conditioning was humming quietly, pushing a chill into a room occupied by 23 senior partners and analysts. We were deep into a brutal quarterly review. I am a senior financial analyst. My entire career is built on risk assessment, identifying corporate bleed, and executing ruthless damage control. My colleagues literally call me the fixer. If a multimillion-dollar account is hemorrhaging cash, they send me in to find the leak, fire the responsible parties, and patch the hull. Ironically, in a sick twist of fate, that is the exact same role I have played in my family my entire life. I was the fixer. I was the human ATM. I was the guy who cleaned up the mess so the rest of the Vance family could pretend they were perfect. My phone was resting face down on the polished mahogany of the conference table. I felt it vibrate against the wood. A short, sharp buzz. Then another. Then three more in rapid succession. I recognized the vibration pattern immediately. It was the wedding group chat. My younger brother Julian was getting married to his fiancée, Chloe, in exactly 3 weeks. The group chat had been a relentless nightmare of notifications for months. I fully expected these new messages to be another endless, exhausting debate about whether the custom linen napkins should be eggshell white or ivory, or perhaps another complaint from my mother about the catering menu not having enough vegan options for her country club friends. I glanced at the screen, keeping my face perfectly neutral while my direct supervisor presented a highly detailed slide on third-quarter market volatility. The preview banner at the top of my screen showed a single line of text from Julian. "You are not invited to the wedding. Goodbye, loser." I blinked. I read it again, my brain struggling to process the syntax. The words remained exactly the same. Then, a small icon popped up right beneath his message. It was a reaction. My father, Edward Vance, the proud, unyielding CEO of Vance Enterprises, had given the text a thumbs up. A few seconds later, an aunt sent a laughing emoji. A cousin replied with a shocked face. The corporate boardroom around me kept talking. Someone down the table chuckled at a dry joke about inflation rates. The projector hummed quietly overhead. But inside my chest, the world stopped spinning. The air in my lungs turned to lead. I did not feel broken. I did not feel the sudden, desperate urge to cry or scream. Instead, I felt a cold, hard, heavy lock click into place deep within my mind. It was like a massive steel door I never even knew existed suddenly swung wide open, letting in a freezing, absolutely clarifying wind. I reached out, unlocked my phone, typed one single word, and hit send. Fine. I set the phone back down, turned it completely off, and returned my undivided attention to the financial slides on the projector screen. But behind my professional nod and my perfectly calm demeanor, a massive, catastrophic calculation had already begun. What Julian and my father did not understand, what none of them would comprehend until the ground fell out from under their feet, was that every single contract for that lavish wedding had my name printed on the dotted line. My pristine credit score, my signature, my hard-earned salary, and I was about to take every single red cent of it back. The quarterly meeting wrapped up an agonizing hour later. My supervisor, Linda, stopped by my chair as I was gathering my notes. She praised my recent analysis on a corporate merger, telling me I was on the fast track for that promotion. She was completely unaware that her most reliable analyst had just been exiled from his own bloodline via a group chat message. I thanked her, my voice remarkably steady, my smile perfectly practiced and warm. It is terrifying how easily your mouth can form polite, professional words while your entire reality is burning to the ground behind your eyes. I walked back to my private office, stepped inside, and shut the door. The heavy click of the latch echoed in the quiet room. I sat down at my desk, pulled up my banking app, and opened the shared wedding folder on my laptop. Julian's wedding to Chloe was scheduled at the Cedar Grove estate, the most exclusive, ridiculously overpriced venue in the state. The venue alone required a $45,000 non-refundable deposit. The organic, farm-to-table catering contract was $28,000. The imported floral arrangements were $12,000. The celebrity photographer, the live band, the crystal rentals, the custom 5-tier cake. The grand total was pushing $110,000. And every single agreement, every single binding contract, bore the legal signature of Arthur Vance. Every massive deposit was inextricably linked to my primary checking account. Why? Because Julian's credit score was absolute garbage, utterly ruined by years of missed payments, defaulted loans, and maxed-out credit cards. Chloe supposedly had her wealth tied up in some complicated offshore trust fund she could never properly explain, claiming her money was temporarily illiquid. My parents claimed their cash flow was tight due to a sudden real estate slump, but promised on their lives they would reimburse me from the generous wedding gifts they expected from their wealthy friends. It was the exact same empty, manipulative promise they had fed me for a decade. I opened the venue's online vendor portal first. I found the master cancellation button. A bright red warning window popped up on my screen, stating in bold letters that I would lose a massive percentage of the deposit if I canceled this close to the date. I did not care. The initial money was already gone, burned in the fires of their entitlement, but the ongoing legal liability was what I needed to sever immediately. I clicked confirm. The reservation vanished. I moved to the caterer. I drafted a blunt, legally binding email citing a total cancellation of services, CC'd my personal lawyer just to make it terrifyingly official, and hit send. I did the exact same thing for the florist, then the live band, then the photographer. The absolute piece de resistance was the rental car. Julian had demanded a vintage Porsche for his grand getaway vehicle, complaining that a standard limousine was too tacky for his aesthetic. He could not afford the astronomical insurance premium required to rent a classic exotic car, so I had put it on my platinum card. I called the high-end rental agency directly, spoke to a very confused floor manager, and aggressively revoked my authorization, demanding a confirmation number for the cancellation. By the time I left my office that evening, the social event of the year had been systematically and ruthlessly dismantled. I had stripped their perfect wedding down to the studs. I drove back to my apartment in total silence. The city lights blurred past my windshield. The next morning, I woke up, brewed a strong cup of black coffee, and finally turned my phone back on. The screen instantly froze, then became a chaotic, cascading waterfall of notifications. My father had sent 30 text messages, escalating from confusion to panic to absolute, unhinged rage. My mother and Julian had left a combined total of 107 missed calls. The voicemails were a chaotic mix of threats, tears, demands, and vicious insults. I poured my coffee, walked out to my balcony, and watched the morning traffic below. I did not reply to a single message. I stayed completely silent. I thought the worst of the betrayal was right there on my screen. I thought cutting off the money would be the end of the drama. I was so incredibly wrong. To truly understand how my family reached the point where discarding me via a group chat felt completely normal to them, you have to understand the toxic dynamic we operated under for decades. I was the eldest son, but I was never, ever the favorite. Julian was the golden child. He was handsome, incredibly charismatic, and completely allergic to hard work or responsibility. If Julian wanted something, The universe was expected to bend and break to accommodate him. If I wanted something, I was told to work harder, stop being selfish, and remember my place in the family hierarchy. The most glaring, painful example of this dynamic happened during a Thanksgiving dinner when I was 18 years old. I had spent the previous 4 years working exhausting after-school jobs. I bagged groceries. I mowed lawns in the sweltering heat. I tutored rich kids in math, contributing every single spare dollar I made into a college fund my parents supposedly managed and matched. I had my eyes set on a solid state university, dreaming of a degree that would get me out of that house. As we sat around the massive dining table that Thanksgiving, passing the turkey and the sweet potatoes, my father cleared his throat, tapped his crystal wine glass, and announced he had an early surprise for Julian's 16th birthday. He reached into his pocket and handed Julian a heavy set of keys. It was a brand new, shiny sports car parked right in our driveway. I sat there, frozen, quietly eating my dinner, waiting to hear how they managed to afford such an extravagant gift when they had just complained about property taxes. Later that night, when everyone was asleep, I logged into our family banking portal to check the joint account where my college fund was held. It was completely empty, a zero balance. Over $20,000 of my blood, sweat, and tears completely wiped out. When I confronted my father in his locked study, my heart pounding in my chest, he did not even look up from his paperwork. He simply adjusted his glasses and told me that Julian needed reliable, safe transportation for his important extracurricular activities. He looked me dead in the eye and told me I was smart enough to take out student loans, that I was the strong one, that I could handle the burden. I handled it by taking on a crushing amount of high-interest debt that took me a full decade of my adult life to pay off. I handled it by learning, at 18 years old, that my future and my security would always be sacrificed on the altar of Julian's comfort. This sickening pattern calcified as we grew older. I became the unofficial bank and crisis manager of the Vance family. I kept a hidden Excel spreadsheet on my laptop titled Family Liabilities. Age 24, I paid the massive security deposit for Julian's luxury downtown apartment after he trashed his previous one and got evicted. Age 26, I took out a dangerous personal loan to cover emergency payroll for Vance Enterprises when my father's construction company hit a mysterious rough patch. He shook my hand, promised me equity in the business, and promised me a massive return on investment. I never saw a single dime of that money again. I paid my mother's exorbitant HOA fees when she forgot about them for 6 months. I bailed Julian out of credit card debt twice. The spreadsheet total currently sat at over $150,000, not even including the wedding expenses I had just incinerated. But the memory that haunted me the most, the one that tasted like bitter ash in my mouth every time I closed my eyes, was the funeral of my grandmother, Beatrice. Grandma Beatrice passed away 2 years ago. She was a fierce force of nature, a sharp-tongued, brilliant woman who built a small but highly lucrative real estate empire in Galveston from absolutely nothing. She was the only person in the entire Vance family who looked at me and saw Arthur, the man, not just an ATM or a convenient stepping stone. She taught me how to read complex legal contracts when I was a teenager. She taught me the absolute value of financial independence. It poured freezing rain on the day of her funeral. A miserable, bone-chilling, relentless drizzle. We stood under massive black umbrellas near the gravesite, the mud ruining our dress shoes. The grief was a heavy, physical weight pressing down on my chest. As the Reverend concluded the service, my Aunt Clara, Beatrice's younger sister, approached me. She looked absolutely terrified, glancing over her shoulder like a hunted animal. She grabbed my arm, her grip shockingly tight, her fingernails digging through my suit jacket, and leaned in close. "Arthur, you need to ask your father about the will," she whispered, her voice trembling so hard her teeth chattered. Beatrice made changes. She told me exactly what she did. Do not let Edward. Before she could finish her desperate sentence, a heavy, aggressive hand clamped down hard on Clara's fragile shoulder. It was my father. His face was a perfect, socially acceptable mask of polite mourning, but his eyes were pure, terrifying ice. He physically inserted his large frame between us, forcing Clara to step back. "Clara," my father said, his tone dripping with a very subtle, razor-sharp menace. "This is absolutely not the time to burden Arthur with your emotional confusion. Margaret needs you at the reception. Now." He practically shoved her toward the waiting line of black limousines. I was too consumed by the raw grief of losing the only person who loved me to push the issue. Later that week, sitting in our living room, my father formally announced that Beatrice had left her entire estate to my mother, Margaret, as was standard traditional practice. He claimed the will was incredibly simple and straightforward, leaving a few trinkets to Clara and the bulk of the assets to her only daughter. I believed him, because why in the world would a grieving son doubt his own father's word regarding his grandmother's dying wishes? That single moment of blind, naive trust was the biggest, most expensive mistake of my adult life. Now, sitting in my quiet apartment with a dead phone locked in a drawer, the memory of Aunt Clara's terrified, pale face violently resurfaced. The gears in my mind, honed by years of analyzing corporate fraud and identifying risk, started grinding with a sickening realization. If they could casually uninvite me from a $100,000 wedding I paid for, what else were they capable of? What boundaries had they already crossed? I opened my laptop. I needed to make absolutely sure every single wedding contract was dead and buried. I did not want a single legal loophole that would allow these vendors to charge my credit card for massive cancellation fees without my explicit written consent. I navigated to the cloud storage drive where Julian, Chloe, and I shared documents for the wedding planning. I clicked through the digital folders, catering menus, ridiculous floral arrangements, expansive guest lists, and then, at the bottom of the directory, I saw a randomly named subfolder labeled Miscellaneous Contracts. I opened it, fully expecting to find the DJ's equipment rider or a lighting invoice. Instead, I found a downloaded, multi-page email thread saved as a PDF. It looked like Chloe had saved it to the shared drive by absolute, careless accident while trying to organize her own files. The email chain was sent from Chloe's private, encrypted account to a man named Marcus. I recognized the name immediately. Marcus was supposed to be a vendor, a high-end, incredibly expensive lighting technician Julian had insisted on hiring for the reception. I zoomed in and began to read. The first few emails were mundane, discussing invoice structures and deposit dates. But as I scrolled down to the older messages in the chain, the tone shifted drastically into something venomous. Julian is utterly clueless. Chloe had written 4 months ago, right around the exact time I was pressured into putting down the massive venue deposit. He actually thinks I care about the seating arrangements or the stupid flowers. Just play along with the lighting budget, pad the numbers by 20%. Once we are officially married, his father is opening the family trust. Edward practically guaranteed it to get me to sign the prenup. Marcus had replied later that evening, "You sure the older brother won't notice the padded invoices? The finance guy? He seems tight-fisted." Chloe's response made the blood in my veins turn to absolute ice. "Arthur is a pathetic, desperate workaholic. He just signs the checks to try and buy their love because he knows he's the ugly duckling. This wedding is just business, babe. I will endure the boring ceremony. We wait for the estate money to clear the accounts, and we are out. We split the cash, file for a quiet divorce, and move to the coast, just like we planned." I read the horrible words over and over until they burned into my retinas. This wedding is just business. Wait for the estate money to clear. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen. Chloe was not a blushing, innocent bride deeply in love with my brother. She was a highly calculated predator, and she was actively, maliciously conspiring with her secret lover to drain my family's wealth. But there was a massive, gaping flaw in her logic. What family trust? What estate money? Vance Enterprises was currently struggling to secure basic building materials. My parents were constantly claiming they were broke, complaining about the economy. There was no secret vault of gold waiting for Julian. Unless Unless Aunt Clara was telling the truth at the funeral. Unless Grandma Beatrice had left something massive behind. Something my father was desperately hiding from me, but secretly using as shiny bait to secure a wealthy-looking bride to elevate his golden child's social status. I saved the emails, exported them to a secure, encrypted offline drive, and gently closed the laptop. The deep sadness of being uninvited completely evaporated. The stinging hurt of my family's betrayal was gone. In its place was a cold, calculating, terrifying fury. I was done being the victim. I was done being the fixer. It was time to hunt. I needed solid leverage, and I needed it fast. The emails were incredibly damning, but in a court of law or a public confrontation, they could be dismissed as a joke or taken out of context. I needed a living, breathing witness who could corroborate Chloe's dark history. I spent the next 4 hours utilizing every background check software I had access to. I tracked down a woman named Sarah, a former executive assistant who had worked closely with Chloe at a boutique public relations firm before she was unceremoniously fired a year ago under highly suspicious circumstances. We arranged to meet at a rundown, neon-lit diner on the absolute outskirts of the city, far away from anyone my family might know. The place smelled overwhelmingly of stale grease, burned coffee, and cheap bleach. Sarah slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from me, pulling her coat tight around her shoulders, constantly looking over her shoulder with nervous, darting eyes. She was a young woman in her late 20s, clearly exhausted by life and carrying a heavy, visible burden of resentment. "I don't want any trouble with the Van Cess," Sarah said immediately, wrapping her trembling hands tightly around a thick ceramic coffee mug. "Your father has ruthless corporate lawyers. I know who Edward Vance is. They can ruin my life with a single phone call. My father is currently blowing up my phone because I just aggressively cut off the funding for his precious $100,000 social event," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly low and steady, projecting absolute calm. "I am not here to protect him, Sarah. I want to know about Chloe. I want to know about Marcus. Tell me what she did to you, and I promise you will never have to worry about the Van Cess again." Sarah's eyes widened slightly, taking in the cold determination in my face. "You know about Marcus? I know enough to burn them. Tell me the rest." Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath. The dam finally broke. She told me everything, the words spilling out in a rushed, angry whisper. Chloe and Marcus had been running a highly sophisticated long-term con for years. They specifically targeted wealthy, gullible men from prominent families. That vintage Porsche that Julian was so obsessed with driving away in? It was not just a prop. It was a crucial part of the elaborate illusion Chloe built to make herself look like old money. She leased luxury items, maxed out massive credit lines under shell LLCs, and flawlessly played the part of an untouchable trust fund heiress to hook Julian's massive ego. "Chloe found out about your family's money almost immediately," Sarah whispered, leaning across the sticky, syrup-stained table. "She bragged about it in the office break room before she got me fired to cover her tracks. She said Julian was an absolute idiot, a golden retriever with a credit card, but his father was sitting on a massive, highly valuable piece of Galveston real estate and a 7-figure cash account left over from a dead grandmother. She said Edward privately promised Julian full access to the inheritance if he settled down, stopped partying, and married a respectable, high-society woman. I felt the stale air completely leave my lungs. The diner around me seemed to fade into a blur. A 7-figure cash account, Galveston real estate, Grandma Beatrice's beach house. "Are you absolutely 100% sure about the grandmother's estate?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp, fighting to keep my composure. "Chloe saw the actual legal documents," Sarah confirmed, nodding emphatically. "Edward showed them to her in his study to prove the money was real and waiting for them. She was planning to marry Julian, endure him for a year, wait out the inheritance transfer to hit his accounts, and then file for a high-net-worth divorce while aggressively hiding the liquid assets with Marcus in offshore accounts." I thanked Sarah, threw a $100 bill on the table for her coffee, and walked out to my car. The puzzle pieces were slamming together in my mind with brutal, undeniable force. My father was using an inheritance that very likely belonged to me to buy a high-status bride for his golden child. Completely, foolishly unaware that the pristine bride was running her own vicious scam to steal every last penny of it. It was a snake eating its own tail in a pit of greed. I drove straight to Aunt Clara's house, ignoring the speed limits. She lived in a quiet, unassuming suburb, in a modest ranch-style home surrounded by wildly overgrown rose bushes. She opened the front door, her face instantly breaking into a look of absolute, pale shock when she saw me standing on her welcome mat. "Arthur," she breathed, her hand flying to her chest. "I didn't think you would ever come. I thought Edward had poisoned you against me." "You tried to warn me at the funeral," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation, my voice echoing in her quiet hallway. "I was too blind to listen. I need to know what you know, Clara, right now." Aunt Clara led me into her small, sunlit kitchen. She poured me a glass of sweet tea, her hands shaking so badly the ice clinked violently against the glass. She walked over to an old, heavy oak cabinet, used a small key to unlock a hidden bottom drawer, and pulled out a yellowed, tightly sealed envelope. She placed it on the table between us with the reverence of someone handling a loaded weapon. "Beatrice gave me this exactly 2 weeks before she died," Clara said softly, tears pooling in her eyes. "She made me swear on a Bible to give it to you if anything suspicious happened to her. After the funeral, when Edward threatened me at the gravesite, I was terrified, Arthur. He came to my house that night. He said if I spoke a single word to you, he would ensure I lost my pension, my home, and my dignity. He has powerful friends in the bank. He can be ruthless." I stared at the heavy envelope. My name was written on the front in Beatrice's elegant, unmistakable, looping cursive. I tore it open, my heart hammering against my ribs. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored stationery. "My dearest Arthur, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the vultures in our family are likely already circling my bones. You are the only one in this entire bloodline with a spine, a work ethic, and a moral compass. The rest of them take and take until there is absolutely nothing left but empty promises. I refuse to let them drain what I have spent a lifetime building. I have secretly drawn up a new, finalized will. I am leaving the Galveston Beach house and my entire high-yield savings account directly and exclusively to you. Do not let your father touch a single cent of it. He is drowning in his own incredibly bad business decisions. His company is a house of cards, and he will try to use my hard-earned legacy to save his sinking ship. The real will is filed safely with my attorney, Theodore Grant. Protect yourself, my boy. You owe them nothing. You never did. All my love, Grandma Beatrice." I read the letter 3 times. The blue ink blurred as my vision swam with hot tears. The only woman who actually loved me, who saw me for who I was, had tried to protect me from the grave. She had given me the ultimate shield, the ultimate validation, and my father had violently ripped it out of my hands while I was standing over her open grave, mourning her. The tears that fell onto the wooden table were not just grief. They were pure, unadulterated, blinding rage. Edward stood up in court and told the probate judge that Beatrice left everything to Margaret, Clara whispered, wiping her own tears. He produced a typed will. It looked official. It had signatures. But I knew in my bones it was a lie. "He forged it," I said, my voice eerily, frighteningly calm. "He destroyed the real will and submitted a fake to steal my future." "You have to prove it, Arthur. Theodore Grant is a good man, but he is retired now. Edward bypassed his law firm completely when he filed the paperwork. You are going up against a man with a lot to lose." I left Clara's house with the letter safely tucked into the inside pocket of my jacket. I did not go home. I drove directly to the county courthouse in the center of the city. I needed to see the public record. I needed to see the forgery with my own 2 eyes before I burned my father's life down. The archives building was freezing cold, smelling heavily of floor wax, dust, and old paper. I approached the clerk's desk, flashing my corporate ID and maintaining a polite, professional smile that hid the violence in my heart. I requested the probate records for the estate of Beatrice Vance. It took 30 agonizing minutes for the clerk to retrieve the physical file from the back room. I sat at a small wooden table under flickering fluorescent lights and opened the heavy manila folder. There it was, the last will and testament of Beatrice Vance, naming Margaret Vance as the sole, uncontested beneficiary, with Edward Vance acting as the executor of the estate with full power of attorney. I flipped aggressively to the last page. I stared at the signature line. It was a decent forgery, clearly traced with a light box, but it lacked the fluid, confident, sweeping stroke of my grandmother's actual hand. The loops on the B were far too tight, the pen pressure too perfectly even. It was the careful, terrified signature of a man trying desperately not to make a mistake that would send him to federal prison. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every single page, capturing the notary stamps and the dates. As I gathered my things to leave, zipping my briefcase, the hairs on the back of my neck suddenly stood straight up. I felt eyes on me. I slowly glanced toward the glass doors of the archive room. Standing near the metal detectors, partially obscured by a pillar, was Victor. Victor was my father's director of operations, which was polite corporate speak for his personal henchman and intimidation tactic. He was a hulking, silent man who handled the messy evictions and the aggressive debt collections for Vance Enterprises. He was staring directly at me, a cell phone pressed tight to his ear, his eyes dark and unblinking. My father was actively tracking my movements. He knew I was digging. I didn't panic. I am a fixer. I thrive under pressure. I walked out of the archive room, turned right instead of heading for the main exit where Victor was waiting, and ducked smoothly into the employee-only stairwell. I took the concrete stairs down to the basement level, navigated through the labyrinthine service corridor filled with utility carts, and exited out the loading dock into the blinding afternoon sun. I walked 3 blocks in the opposite direction of my parked car, hailed a passing cab, and had the driver drop me off a mile away at a coffee shop before quietly looping back to retrieve my vehicle. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white and my hands ached. My own father had stolen my financial future, funded a fake, luxurious life for his favorite son using my stolen money, and sent a corporate thug to intimidate me. I thought the deep, humiliating pain of being uninvited to a wedding via a group chat was the absolute bottom of the barrel. I was wrong. The storm was just gathering its strength over the ocean, and I was about to become the lightning. The very next morning, acting with the precision of a military operation, I secured a private meeting with Theodore Grant. His law office was located in a historic, ivy-covered building downtown. All dark oak paneling, heavy leather-bound books, and the smell of expensive cigars. He was a man in his late 70s, walking with a cane, but possessing the kind of quiet, terrifying authority that only comes from fighting decades of vicious legal battles in civil court. I sat across from him at his massive desk and laid my cards entirely on the table. I showed him the high-resolution photos of the forged will I had pulled from the courthouse archives. I placed the original, handwritten letter from Grandma Beatrice right next to them. Mr. Grant adjusted his thick glasses, examining the documents with a heavy, deeply sorrowful sigh that seemed to age him 10 years. "I knew Beatrice for 40 years, Arthur," he said, his voice gravelly and thick with emotion. "When she came into this very office to draft that final will, she was incredibly adamant. She wanted a watertight, ironclad document. She knew Edward's character better than anyone. She knew he would try to contest it or manipulate your mother. Then how in the hell did he get a blatantly forged will through a probate judge?" I asked, my voice tight with frustration. "Edward is a highly connected man in this city," Grant replied bitterly, leaning back in his leather chair. "He filed the documents quietly in a neighboring county court where he plays golf with the presiding judge. He submitted a sworn affidavit claiming I was no longer representing the estate due to my declining cognitive health. A complete, malicious fabrication that nearly cost me my license. By the time I caught wind of the probate hearing, the assets had already been legally transferred to your mother's name, and Edward had total control." How much are we talking about, Theodore? I need the exact numbers. I needed to know the true scale of the theft. I needed to know exactly how much they had stolen from my life. Grant pulled a heavy, locked ledger from his bottom desk drawer, flipped through the pages, and ran his finger down a column of numbers. The Galveston Beach house, prime, highly sought-after waterfront real estate, was valued at the time of her death at roughly $800,000. Furthermore, she had a high-yield savings account, various liquid assets, and a small stock portfolio totaling just over $480,000. The total estate was worth nearly $1.3 million. And Arthur, every single penny of it was legally, rightfully yours. $1.3 million. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical, suffocating blow to the chest. I had spent my 20s eating cheap ramen noodles, living in a cramped studio apartment, and working 80-hour weeks to pay off predatory loans I took out for Julian's car and my mother's credit card debt. Meanwhile, my parents sat in their massive house, hoarding $1 million fortune that belonged to me, watching me struggle and never offering a single dime. "Can we reverse it?" I asked, my voice turning hard, the sadness entirely replaced by a need for vengeance. "Can we prove criminal fraud? With this handwritten letter, and my sworn testimony regarding the true will I kept securely locked in my vault?" "Yes," Grant nodded firmly, a dangerous spark returning to his old eyes. "We can file an immediate emergency injunction and a massive civil lawsuit for fraud, forgery, and breach of fiduciary duty. We can freeze every single asset Edward Vance currently holds before he can hide them. Draft the paperwork immediately," I commanded, standing up from the chair. "But do not file it yet. Have it ready. I want the injunction ready to deploy on my specific signal." I left the lawyer's office with a loaded weapon in my pocket, the safety completely off. But I wasn't finished. I still needed to understand why. Edward Vance was a raging narcissist, yes, but he wasn't usually stupid enough to risk federal prison. Forging a will was a desperate, wildly reckless move. Why was he so desperate 2 years ago? I went back to my apartment, locked the deadbolt, and tapped into the elite financial databases I used for my corporate firm. I pulled the public records, tax filings, and corporate credit reports for Vance Enterprises. I spent 6 agonizing hours doing a forensic, line-by-line deep dive into my father's construction empire. The truth I uncovered was absolutely pathetic. Vance Enterprises was a hollow, rotting shell. The company was drowning in massive, unmanageable debt. I found 3 separate IRS tax liens filed against their corporate accounts for unpaid payroll taxes. I found multiple pending lawsuits from angry subcontractors who hadn't been paid in over 18 months. The company was functionally insolvent, hemorrhaging cash daily, and teetering on the absolute edge of a messy, public bankruptcy. Then, I cross-referenced the property records for the Galveston Beach house. My stomach dropped into my shoes. The property had been sold exactly 6 months ago. The buyer was a massive commercial real estate developer. Edward had liquidated Grandma Beatrice's beloved house to inject a massive amount of cash into his dying company, just to keep the lights on and maintain his pathetic illusion of wealth to his country club friends. Suddenly, the entire insane puzzle clicked perfectly into place. The grand, ridiculous wedding. The aggressive insistence that I put the massive venue deposits on my credit cards. The desperate, sweaty need to impress Chloe and her supposedly wealthy family. It was all a theatrical production. Edward desperately needed the wedding to happen to convince his wary investors, specifically a notoriously strict, billionaire venture capitalist named Evelyn Rossi, that the Vance family was still financially robust and worthy of a new round of funding. He needed Julian to marry a wealthy woman like Chloe to secure a new influx of capital and save his reputation. And he needed me to blindly finance the illusion, because my salary and my pristine credit score were the absolute only real assets the Vance family had left to their name. They weren't just casually excluding me from a wedding because I was uncool or annoying. They were actively using my money to fund a scam to cover up a felony, all while laughing at me behind my back and calling me a loser. I looked at the digital calendar on my wall. The wedding was in exactly 5 days. I knew my father would not cancel the event, even though I had pulled the funding. He couldn't. Canceling the wedding would immediately signal severe financial distress to his investors. He would find the money somewhere, probably by taking out aggressive, predatory loans or liquidating his last remaining, heavily penalized retirement accounts, just to pay the vendors in cash and keep the show running. The venue would still be booked. The 120 guests would still arrive. Evelyn Rossi would still be sitting at the VIP head table, evaluating his worth. My phone vibrated violently on the desk. A new text message from Julian popped up on the locked screen. Dad covered the vendors you canceled, you spiteful, jealous piece of trash. The wedding is still happening. We don't need you. You are pathetic. Stay away from us on Saturday. I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, cold, terrifying smile spreading across my face in the empty apartment. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully boxed out the annoying, responsible older brother, saved their precious, fragile facade, and secured their future. I opened my laptop and created a new master presentation file. I dragged in the high-resolution photos of the forged will. I dragged in the damning financial reports showing the IRS liens and the impending, catastrophic bankruptcy of Vance Enterprises. And finally, I dragged in the saved email thread between Chloe and her lover, Marcus, explicitly outlining their plot to divorce Julian and steal the non-existent inheritance money. I meticulously formatted the slides. I saved the entire explosive file onto a sleek, silver USB drive. I slipped the drive into the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I didn't need a pathetic text message invitation to the wedding. I was going to crash it, and I was going to burn the Vance family empire to the ground, right in front of the very people they were trying so desperately to impress. The storm had officially breached the shoreline, and I was standing perfectly still in the eye of it, counting down the hours until Saturday night. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of heavy, suffocating humidity that always precedes a massive Texas thunderstorm. The air felt thick, charged with static electricity, mirroring exactly how I felt inside my tailored charcoal suit. I drove my modest sedan up the winding, oak-lined driveway of the Cedar Grove estate. The venue was glowing against the darkening sky, a sprawling limestone mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. My father, Edward Vance, had performed an absolute miracle of manipulation to keep this venue. When I aggressively canceled the wedding contracts earlier in the week, I assumed the event was dead. But Edward was a man who lived and breathed for optics. He could not afford the public humiliation of a canceled high society wedding. More importantly, he could not afford to let his elite investors, particularly the billionaire venture capitalist Evelyn Rossi, think his family was in any sort of financial distress. So he pivoted. He spun a ridiculous, elaborate lie. He sent out an emergency email to the guest list, claiming that Julian and Chloe had decided to postpone the actual ceremony for a private destination wedding later in the year. But, he insisted, the venue was already paid for, the exquisite catering was prepared, and he wanted to transform the evening into an exclusive Vance Enterprises investor appreciation gala, mixed with a family celebration. It was a desperate, incredibly expensive smokescreen. I knew for a fact he had taken out a high-interest, predatory short-term loan just to pay the vendors in cash and reinstate the bookings. He was literally borrowing money against a burning building to throw a party in the penthouse. I handed my keys to the valet, who looked slightly confused by my standard sedan pulling in behind a line of luxury vehicles. I walked up the grand stone steps and entered the main foyer. The scent of expensive, imported white lilies and roasted garlic hit me instantly. A live string quartet was playing a smooth classical piece in the corner. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos floated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne. It was a perfect, glittering illusion, and I was the wrecking ball. I kept my hand firmly over my breast pocket, feeling the solid, reassuring edge of the silver USB drive containing my master presentation. I walked into the main ballroom, scanning the crowd of 120 guests. These were the absolute pillars of my father's professional network. City councilmen, real estate developers, local politicians, and wealthy socialites. And there, Standing near the massive crystal chandelier was Evelyn Rossi. She was a striking woman in her 60s, wearing a sharp designer suit, sipping sparkling water and looking incredibly bored. She was the whale my father was desperately trying to harpoon. A single signature from her could save Vance Enterprises from bankruptcy. I spotted my mother, Margaret, hovering near the dessert table. She looked thin, fragile, and terrified, clutching her wine glass like it was a life preserver. My brother, Julian, was standing near the custom ice sculpture, looking remarkably stressed for a golden child. His bespoke tuxedo fit perfectly, but his jaw was tight, and he kept checking his luxury watch. Then, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open, and Chloe made her grand entrance. She walked in radiating aggressive confidence, wearing a stunning, pearl-beaded evening gown that likely cost more than my first car. But what caught my attention was the commotion outside the tall glass windows. The valet was carefully parking a vintage, cherry-red Porsche right by the front steps. Julian had demanded that car. I had canceled the rental. Clearly, Chloe, panicked by the thought of losing her wealthy aesthetic in front of high society, had reached into her own secret funds, or perhaps Marcus's illicit accounts, to rent the vehicle herself at the very last minute. She was desperately keeping up the charade. My father saw me before I saw him. He marched across the marble floor, his face a perfect mask of host-like geniality, but his eyes were burning with a white-hot, homicidal fury. "Arthur," Edward hissed, grabbing my upper arm with a grip that bruised the bone, pulling me behind a large floral arrangement. "What in the hell are you doing here? You were explicitly told to stay away. You have caused enough damage this week. I will not let you ruin this networking event." I looked down at his hand gripping my jacket, then looked him dead in the eye. My heart was completely steady. Years of being intimidated by this man simply evaporated. "I am a member of the Vance family, Edward," I said, keeping my voice incredibly smooth and loud enough for a passing waiter to hear. "I came to celebrate our immense success. Besides, I brought a presentation, a comprehensive financial review. I thought your investors would deeply appreciate my analytical perspective on the future of your company." Edward's face lost all its color. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. He knew what I did for a living. He knew my forensic accounting skills were unmatched. "Arthur, please," he said, the anger instantly giving way to a sickening, desperate panic. His voice dropped to a pathetic whisper. "Do not do this. I know you are hurt about the college fund. I know you are angry about the wedding deposits. I will pay you back. I swear on my life. With interest. I will write you a check on Monday from my personal account. Just turn around and walk out those doors." "You don't have a personal account anymore, Dad," I replied, hitting him with the cold, hard reality. "I know about the IRS tax liens. I know about the unpaid subcontractors. You do not have a single dollar to your name that isn't leveraged against a lie." Before he could respond, the event coordinator tapped a microphone on the main stage. The feedback echoed sharply through the ballroom, commanding everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the coordinator announced cheerfully, "if you could please take your seats. Mr. Edward Vance has prepared a multimedia presentation regarding the exciting future of Vance Enterprises," followed by a toast to his family. Edward had planned to show a slideshow of fake architectural renderings and happy family photos to secure his funding. He had a laptop set up on a podium, connected to the massive projector screen descending behind the stage. I shoved past my father, moving with absolute, unshakable purpose. I walked directly up the steps of the stage. The crowd went silent, confused by the sudden change in the program. Julian glared at me from his table. Chloe rolled her eyes. Evelyn Rossi leaned forward in her chair, suddenly very interested. I reached the podium. I pulled the USB drive from my pocket, plugged it into the laptop, and overrode my father's presentation with my own. I tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the massive room. "My name is Arthur Vance. I am Edward's eldest son. I am also a senior risk analyst for a major financial firm. My father asked me here tonight to provide total transparency regarding the financial health of the Vance family and our legacy. And transparency is exactly what you are going to get. I clicked the remote in my hand. The massive screen behind me lit up. The trap was sprung. And there was absolutely no way out for any of them. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning vents humming. 120 pairs of eyes shifted from me to the massive, bright screen behind my back. The first slide was incredibly simple. It displayed two high-resolution images side by side. On the left was a document titled Last Will and Testament of Beatrice Vance. On the right was a close-up photograph of a handwritten letter, bearing my grandmother's distinctive, elegant cursive signature. 2 years ago, my grandmother Beatrice passed away. I began, pacing slowly across the stage, owning the room. She was a brilliant woman who built a highly successful real estate portfolio in Galveston. When she died, my father, Edward Vance, stood in a probate court and presented the document you see on the left, claiming she left her entire estate to my mother. It was a very neat, very convenient arrangement. I clicked the remote. The screen zoomed in on the signature of the official will. However, I continued, projecting my voice to reach the back tables where the politicians sat. As any forensic document examiner will tell you, and as my attorney Theodore Grant is prepared to testify in civil court next week, this signature is a blatant criminal forgery. The document on the right is a verified, handwritten letter from Beatrice herself, clearly stating her intention to leave her massive Galveston property and her 7-figure savings account to me, Arthur Vance. My father bypassed her longtime lawyer, forged her signature on a fake document, and stole an inheritance worth $1.3 million from his own son. A loud, collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Evelyn Rossi set her sparkling water down on the table with a sharp, heavy clink. "Arthur, stop this immediately," Edward shouted, rushing toward the stage, his face purple with rage and terror. "He is having a mental breakdown. Security, remove him. Security works for the venue, Edward," I said calmly into the microphone, not breaking eye contact with the crowd. "And considering you paid them with a predatory, high-interest loan you took out on Thursday, I doubt they care about family politics." I clicked the remote again. The forged will disappeared. In its place appeared 3 separate, heavily redacted, but highly official government documents. The red stamps of the Internal Revenue Service were impossible to miss. "You might be wondering why a successful CEO would risk federal prison to forge a will," I said, leaning casually against the podium. "The answer is always desperation. This brings us to the health of Vance Enterprises. Despite what you have been told tonight, this company is functionally insolvent." I pointed to the screen. "What you are looking at are 3 active IRS tax liens for unpaid corporate payroll taxes. Furthermore, there are currently 4 pending lawsuits from local subcontractors who have not been paid in 18 months. To cover his massive debts, Edward liquidated the stolen Galveston real estate 6 months ago. The money is gone. Vance Enterprises is a hollow shell, aggressively heading toward a messy, highly public bankruptcy. Any investment made into this company tonight is effectively throwing cash into an incinerator." Evelyn Rossi stood up. She did not say a single word. She picked up her designer handbag, gave my father a look of absolute, chilling disgust, and walked straight down the center aisle toward the exit. 3 other prominent investors immediately stood up and followed her. The dominoes were falling. "Now," I said, raising my hand to quiet the rising murmur of panicked voices, "before the rest of you leave, let us address the happy couple, Julian and Chloe." Julian looked like he was going to vomit. Chloe was gripping the edge of her table, her perfect posture crumbling. I clicked the remote for the 3rd time. The financial documents vanished, replaced by a series of glaringly bright, incredibly incriminating email screenshots. "My brother Julian was supposed to get married in 3 weeks," I explained, looking directly at the golden child. "My parents pushed heavily for this union, believing Chloe came from immense wealth. They wanted a wealthy daughter-in-law to save their social standing. But Chloe is not a trust fund heiress. The vintage Porsche parked out front, rented on a maxed-out credit card. Chloe jumped up from her chair. "You have no right. This is illegal," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing wildly in the large room. "What is illegal, Chloe? Is conspiracy to commit fraud?" I shot back, my voice turning to steel. I read directly from the screen behind me. This is an email sent from Chloe to her secret lover, Marcus, 4 months ago. Quote, "This wedding is just business, babe. I will endure the boring ceremony. We wait for the estate money to clear the accounts, and we are out. We split the cash, file for a quiet divorce, and move to the coast." I looked at Julian. He was staring at the screen, his mouth open, his eyes wide with a horrific, devastating realization. The woman he loved, the woman he thought elevated his status, viewed him as nothing more than an easy mark. Chloe found out about the forged inheritance money, I explained to the stunned crowd. She demanded a prenup that gave her rights to future assets. She planned to marry Julian, wait for my father to transfer my stolen money into Julian's accounts, and then steal it all in a high-net-worth divorce settlement. It was a scam built on top of a forgery. The ballroom erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. Guests were shouting. Subcontractors who had been invited were demanding their money from my father. Chloe realized the game was entirely over. She grabbed her purse, shoved her way through a group of stunned socialites, and ran out the front doors, abandoning the rented Porsche and her fake life. But the most shocking moment of the night did not come from me. It came from my mother. Margaret Vance had been silent my entire life. She was a ghost in her own home, always looking away, always enabling Edward's cruelty. But as the room descended into madness, as Julian collapsed into a chair sobbing, and Edward grabbed his chest, gasping for air as his empire vanished, Margaret walked slowly toward Julian. Julian looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. "Mom, why? Why did Dad do this? Why did he hate Arthur so much? And why was I the only one he protected if the company was failing?" Margaret looked at her golden child, then looked at Edward, who was clutching the edge of a table, trying to breathe. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but it carried in the immediate vicinity. "Because you are not his son, Julian?" she whispered, her voice trembling but resolute. The words hit like a physical shockwave. Julian froze. I froze on the stage. "What?" Julian gasped. "Before you were born, Edward and I separated for 6 months," Margaret confessed, tears streaming down her face. "I had an affair. When I got pregnant, I came back. Edward agreed to raise you to save his public image. But he knew. He always knew." Suddenly, 34 years of severe, toxic psychological abuse clicked perfectly into place. It was the ultimate, devastating twist. Edward didn't favor Julian because Julian was better. Edward favored Julian because he was compensating for a massive, secret shame. He spoiled Julian to prove to the world, and to himself, that he was a magnanimous patriarch. And me? I was his actual biological son. I was the constant, walking reminder of the marriage that failed. I was the blood he resented because I looked like him, acted like him, but represented a family dynamic he despised. He punished me for existing, and he used my money to fund the illusion of a perfect family with a son who wasn't even his. I stood on the stage, looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. The secrets were out. The poison was drained. I unplugged my USB drive, slipped it back into my pocket, walked down the side steps, and exited out the back door into the cool, humid Texas night, leaving them to burn in the fire they built. The fallout from the Cedar Grove Gala was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. By Monday morning, the local business journals had picked up the story of the mass exodus of investors. By Wednesday, my attorney, Theodore Grant, had filed the civil lawsuit and the emergency injunction. The legal system, which moves agonizingly slow for regular people, moves with terrifying speed when presented with ironclad proof of high-dollar fraud. The judge immediately froze every single bank account associated with Edward Vance and Vance Enterprises. Without access to cash flow, the illusion completely shattered. Exactly 14 days after I gave my presentation, Vance Enterprises officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The creditors descended like starved wolves. The heavy machinery was repossessed. The corporate offices were locked down. Edward Vance, the man who cared more about his country club membership than his own flesh and blood, lost absolutely everything. Because his personal assets were tied to the fraudulent sale of Grandma Beatrice's beach house, the courts moved to seize his primary residence. The massive, sprawling estate in the suburbs was foreclosed on. Edward was forced to move into a tiny, run-down, one-bedroom apartment in a noisy complex near the highway. His phone stopped ringing. The politicians and socialites who used to drink his expensive wine no longer recognized him in public. Chloe, unsurprisingly, vanished completely. I heard through the grapevine that she and Marcus skipped town, leaving a massive trail of credit card debt behind them. Julian was left entirely alone. The golden child, stripped of his sports cars, his fake fiancée, and the illusion of his paternity, had to move into a cheap motel and actually look for a real entry-level job for the first time in his 28 years of life. But the most surprising development happened 3 months after the lawsuit was filed. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing the final settlement documents Theodore Grant had sent over. We had won. The courts forced the liquidation of Edward's remaining assets, and the commercial buyer of the beach house agreed to a financial settlement to avoid a lengthy title dispute. The total recovery was $1.2 million, deposited directly into a secure trust in my name. There was a knock on my door. The delivery man handed me a small, heavy cardboard box. There was no return address, just my name written in a familiar, shaky handwriting. I took the box to my kitchen island and cut the tape. Inside, neatly packed in bubble wrap, were several items. There was Grandma Beatrice's vintage silver pocket watch. There was her favorite ceramic coffee mug. And resting on top was a thick, handwritten letter from my mother, Margaret. I hesitated before opening it. I didn't want any more manipulation, but curiosity won. Arthur, I know you will likely never speak to me again, and I accept that as my punishment. I am writing this from a small rental house in Ohio, near my sister. I filed for divorce from Edward last month. The process is ugly, but for the first time in my life, I am free. I need you to know the truth about the will. I knew Edward forged it. I knew he stole your grandmother's money, but I was terrified of him, Arthur. For 30 years, he controlled every dollar, every movement, every relationship I had. He threatened to institutionalize me if I ever spoke up. He used Julian's paternity as a weapon to keep me completely subservient. I was a coward. I let him sacrifice you to save himself, and I will burn in hell for that. But I am the one who left the shared cloud folder open on Julian's laptop. I am the one who deliberately placed Chloe's email thread where you would find it. And when you filed the lawsuit, I am the one who secretly mailed Theodore Grant the internal corporate ledgers proving Edward used the beach house money for the business. It does not erase what I allowed to happen. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I only ask that you take your grandmother's legacy and build a beautiful life, far away from the darkness of this family. Mom. I folded the letter and put it back in the box. It was a massive, unexpected twist. The quiet, compliant enabler had actually been the silent whistleblower who handed me the ammunition I needed to destroy her abuser. It didn't heal the decades of neglect, but it provided a strange, complicated closure. My mother wasn't a monster. She was a victim who finally, at the very end, chose to do one single brave thing. The villains had completely fallen. The dust was settling. The war was officially over. But surviving a war is very different from learning how to live in peacetime. I had the money. I had the vindication. Now, I had to figure out who Arthur Vance was without a crisis to fix. 6 months later, I packed up my entire life in the city, put the keys on the counter of my apartment, and drove south. I didn't want a massive mansion or an exotic sports car. I used a small portion of the $1.2 million to buy a modest, beautifully restored two-bedroom cottage in Galveston. It was located exactly 3 blocks down the coastline from where Grandma Beatrice's original beach house used to stand. I can sit on my wooden front porch in the morning, drink my black coffee, and smell the exact same salt air that she used to love. The money was never about buying luxury. It was about buying absolute freedom. I left the grueling, 80-hour-a-week corporate finance world behind. I realized I had spent my entire adult life analyzing risk for billionaires, trying to earn a promotion just to pay off debts that weren't mine. I didn't want to fix rich people's problems anymore. Instead, I took the bulk of the inheritance and partnered with my Aunt Clara and my former boss Linda, who had graciously offered her network, to establish a non-profit organization. We named it the Beatrice Vance Foundation. Our mission is highly specific. We provide emergency financial grants, aggressive legal representation, and forensic accounting services for individuals, primarily the elderly and young adults, who are victims of familial financial abuse and inheritance fraud. We hunt down the predators who steal from their own blood. Every time we freeze an abusive relative's bank account, I feel my grandmother smiling down on me. As for my biological family, the boundaries I established are made of reinforced concrete. I have not spoken a single word to my father, Edward. Last I heard, he was working as a shift manager at a big-box hardware store, living in a studio apartment, complaining to anyone who will listen about how his ungrateful son ruined his empire. He is completely trapped in a prison of his own making, and I do not lose a single second of sleep over it. I exchange a brief, polite email with my mother on her birthday and on Christmas. She is heavily involved in intense trauma therapy in Ohio. We are not a happy family, but the bleeding has stopped. The only unexpected development has been Julian. Without Edward's toxic money sheltering him, and without the heavy burden of being the golden child to compensate for his mother's affair, Julian completely broke down. He hit rock bottom. But hitting the concrete floor forces you to look up. A year after the gala, Julian drove down to Galveston in a beat-up, used Honda Civic. He looked older, exhausted, but entirely real for the first time in his life. He stood on my porch, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, and he offered a genuine, tearful apology. Not for the wedding text, that was just the catalyst, but for decades of entitlement. He apologized for watching me struggle while he drove cars paid for with my college fund. I didn't forgive him instantly. Forgiveness is a massive house you have to build brick by brick, and we are still just pouring the foundation. But I invited him in for coffee. We talk once a month now. He works in logistics for a shipping company, paying his own rent, seeing a therapist. He is trying, and sometimes trying is all you can ask for. I learned something profound through this entire nightmare. Society pushes this toxic narrative that family is family, implying that shared DNA is a binding contract that forces you to endure endless abuse, financial exploitation, and blatant disrespect. That is a lie. Family is not defined by blood. Family is defined by consistent respect, genuine care, and mutual protection. If the people who share your last name are the ones holding your head underwater, you are not obligated to drown just to keep them comfortable. Setting a boundary isn't an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. That single text message, "Goodbye, loser," was meant to be a devastating insult, a final push out the door. But in reality, it was the greatest gift my brother ever gave me. It was the key to my cage. It gave me the permission I desperately needed to stop being the family ATM and start being the architect of my own life. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to protect your own peace, your own finances, or your own sanity? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who might read it and find the exact courage they need to finally say enough. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.